Okay, welcome back. This is video 4 of the Gull Guide Featured Highlights Series, April 2025. Last time in video 3, we reviewed Table 5 on page 20, detailing the various molt strategies found in our gulls. We noted that ivory gull is the only gull that has no inserted molts and simply goes from one basic plumage to the next, and thus it abides by what's known as simple basic strategy, or SBS. This individual that you're seeing here in plate 8 on page 89 has some mottled brown spotting. That's from its juvenile plumage, and you can see that it's molting some primaries there, all white primaries that are incoming. And so this bird is going to go directly from this spotted like juvenile plumage to an all white adult plumage. The larger gulls, we said, abide by simple alternate strategy. And here we have two molts in each cycle, pre-basic and pre-alternate, resulting in basic plumage and alternate plumage, respectively. These two plumages simply alternate with one another. So these gulls go, they're typically going to be in either basic plumage or alternate plumage, cyclically, with some overlap in the two molts, which I'll discuss a little bit later in this video. Further, we explain that most small gulls have this additional inserted molt in first cycle known as pre-formative, and this results in formative plumage before the additional inserted molt later in the season, the first pre-alternate molt. So really the only difference we said between SAS and CAS is this insertion of an additional molt in first cycle. Okay, so at this time of year, at least in the northern hemisphere, most of our gulls, both small and large gulls, are undergoing pre-alternate molts. These molts are typically limited to head and body feathers, some coverts and such, but they generally don't include primaries, secondaries, and or tail feathers. There are some exceptions. We noted some of those in video 3. But overall, large white-headed gulls right now are becoming brilliantly white-headed, and the smaller gulls are acquiring these hoods or masks. So in addition to this, many adult individuals are now in high breeding condition. So this is where they're transitioning from dull bare parts to brighter bills, brighter orbital ring color and legs. And these things are now becoming more vivid and intensely bright at this time of year. So in plate 20 here on page 13, you could see the California gull on the left from September has this dull bill, so it's in non-breeding condition, but it also has a lot of head streaking, so we assume this is basic plumage. In the middle is a bird, also a California gull, from Washington in January. It now has a brighter bill, but still in basic plumage, as we can see by the heavily streaked head. And then the right bird has an all-white head, so we assume this is alternate plumage. It's April now, and it has corresponding vivid bare parts, so it's in high breeding condition. But I do want to note here that the two are controlled by different mechanisms. So molt produces plumage, whereas these bare parts, we say the birds are undergoing these hormonal events. So the bare parts, the skinned parts and bill and leg color are things that are not controlled by molt. Okay, so we say alternate plumage for this white-headed bird, but breeding condition for the corresponding bright bare parts. You take a good example of this adult Thayer's gull that I photographed last week on Vancouver Island. It's late March, bright bill, vivid pink orbital ring around the eye, but it's sporting basic plumage in its head pattern. So although it might be replacing some of the upper parts in its pre-alternate molt, the head pattern is still assumed to be basic. Furthermore, you'll have, I mentioned the hooded gulls start to take on these black hoods, but at the same time, their bare parts are starting to change color. So this laughing gull on page 20, we see in February is in basic plumage with no hood, but it's also in low breeding condition with a blackish bill. Now in May, on the right, this bird is now in this spiffy, brilliant alternate plumage where it has a full hood, but also in breeding condition where its bill is reddish maroon. Interestingly, in some of the small gulls, like this black-headed gull on page 23, this is a bird that I photographed in Baltimore several months apart, same individual. On the left, we have alternate plumage. You can see this masked look. It's not a hooded gull, it's more of a masked gull. But the bare parts actually don't become brighter here, they become darker. On the right is a bird in December. It's in basic plumage. It loses the hood, but also the bare parts, interestingly, are more intensely colored. And so it's not necessarily true that every gull in breeding condition is going to have brighter bare parts. They could be darker, as we see in this March bird on the left here. Okay, so in this video, what I'd like to explain is a very important concept, and that is when does a gull become a second cycle? So based on modified Humphrey Parks, and this is discussed in detail on the bottom of page 20, and it continues for 3 to 4 pages in the book with a good amount of photographic examples. The brief answer to this question is a gull begins its second molt cycle when we detect the start of the second prebasic molt, which, in short, is signaled by inner primaries beginning to molt. So later this month, in late April and mainly into May, is the time to be looking for this if you live in the Northern Hemisphere. So take this American herring gull, plate 31 on page 21. What you see there is a molt gap with P1 and P2 missing. And so this to us as field observers signals the start of a new prebasic molt. And in this individual, it's the second prebasic molt. And so looking over at plate 32, another American herring gull, but this time in July in Wisconsin, we can see this individual has, new P1, P2, P3, P4, and even P5 here and P6 starting to come out. So this individual is well into its second prebasic molt. And so even in plate 31, this individual is also in its second prebasic molt. And although we don't see any new feathers, that molt gap there is sufficient enough to suggest this bird is no longer a first cycle, it has begun its second molt cycle. Plate 33 is a lesser blackback gull that has almost all of its primaries renewed. This P10 here is an old juvenile feather. But notice it also has most of its secondaries replaced. There's a new tertials here, new tail feathers. So by and large, this bird is almost done with its second prebasic molt. And then the last plate 34 here, is a California gull in September in California, incidentally. And this bird has, P10 left to grow. It's almost fully grown, maybe just a few innermost secondaries. But by and large, this bird is in second basic plumage. And we can assume the second prebasic molt has nearly completed. So again, the short answer to this question of when does a gull graduate to its second molt cycle, and it is as soon as we detect flight feather molt, and that signals the start of the second prebasic molt. Now, you should notice these molt gaps by the end of this month. Some of the more resident birds, some of the more mid-latitude birds, like some of our ringbills, will even start in mid-April. What you'll see is 1 to 2 primaries dropped and perhaps even starting to grow at this time. And this molt is a slow-paced molt. It takes about 5 to 6 months to complete. Molting flight feathers is quite expensive and taxing for these birds, and it tends to be, at least in the younger age groups and the non-breeding age groups, it tends to be a continuous process. And here's an important thing to accept. The 2 molts, pre-alternate molt that we're seeing right now in February, March, April, may be ongoing and overlap with this pre-basic molt that begins later on this month and into May. And so as some flight feathers are molting, some body feathers may still be molting from that pre-alternate molt. So it's not always easy to distinguish exactly which individual feathers are a result of which molt. But by and large, we're able to generally tell which feather track is a result of which molt. So if you look at plate 32, for example, it's assumed that these new scapulars here are second alternate. But then when we get into these wing coverts, it's not always clear if these are second alternate or second basic. And so it's important to point that out, and plate 32 is a perfect example of this. Also, it may be the case that primary molt is favored or accelerated and becomes a focus over other flight feathers, such as the secondaries and the tail feathers. And the primary reason for this is the tail feathers or the secondaries might be in slightly better condition, and they're shorter feathers. They don't take as long to grow as primaries. And so early on in the season, it seems that primaries are a priority and those other feathers soon follow. But there is some randomness to it, especially with the secondaries, and which secondaries get grown first is often variable from one individual to the next. So in plate 32, we already see 4 to 5 new primaries, but it seems like most of those secondaries are juvenile. Whereas in plate 33, we have most of the primaries grown, and more than half of the secondaries have been grown. So that's an important thing to keep in mind there, that the secondary molt is not as systematic and orderly as primary molt tends to be. Okay, with adults, I just want to mention that pre-basic molts tend to be more drawn out or protracted. Sometimes they even suspend briefly during the breeding season as adults tend to their breeding duties. So once the young are close to fledging or have left the nest, adults that were in suspension will pick up and resume flight feather molt. It's for this reason that you'll find some second and third cycle types with fully grown primaries in late September and October. And then you'll still have adults that are growing outer primaries for the next few weeks into November at times. So this is discussed in more detail on page 47. And it's found under variation in molt. And it's quite interesting and fascinating to know that some species are expected to have late molts, for instance, Vega gulls, while others may even have suspended or protracted pre-basic molts over the non-breeding season, as we find in some Pacific black-legged kittiwakes. So if you have interest in that, you can see page 47, 48, where younger birds are done molting flight feathers and adults are still lagging 3 to 4 weeks behind that. Okay, so this sort of concludes our discussion on molt strategies. Again, if you want to go back to page 20, that's a good table there, table 5, to reference from time to time. CBS, complex basic strategies, the only strategy not found in our gulls. But I hope that this helps you navigate the texts and the photos throughout the guide and the species account. In the species accounts, and as I tell everybody in my workshops and field trips, these ideas are often overlooked and ignored by many observers, and that's perfectly fine if it's not your cup of tea. But in my opinion, at least for gull study, these ideas are foundational and something you should keep coming back to as you work through the book. I think you'll find the plumages and appearances of the gulls that you're seeing much more palatable if you keep these precepts in mind. Next time in video 5, I'm going to cover how do we differentiate a second cycle from a third cycle. It's actually fairly reliable, and it's a lot less guesswork than you might think. It actually turned out to be a very systematic question that you can answer just by looking at the appearance of the flight feathers. So this is much more an aging question rather than molt, although the two are intertwined. I'm going to discuss next time in video 5. how we differentiate second cycles from third cycles. If you're reading in the book and would like to get a head start on this, I'll be looking particularly at plates M2 through M10 in the Aging and Molt chapter from pages 25 through 28. And again, if you have any suggestions or requests for future videos, send me a note at thegullguide@gmail.com. Again, that's thegullguide@gmail.com. And thanks again for watching. Till next time.